Good evening, everyone. And we are here today. Welcome to our podcast as we will be speaking on a very engaging topic, a gender transformative agenda and the road to achieving gender equality. This afternoon, we have with us two specially invited guests. And here we have Stacey Palmer, who is a child of God. First, I must say that, Stacey, and of course, a gender development specialist. And besides Stacey, we have Judith Wedderburn, and most persons would know Judith. Judith has done some work with us in the past in terms of gender development studies and would have been the former head of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung chapter here in the Caribbean. So our presenters will be speaking on the theme, and I just want to quickly introduce my first speaker and to let you know a little bit about Stacey. So Stacey is a daughter of the King of Kings, and she is a writer. She writes well. She's also a part-time lecturer and an executive assistant who holds a Master of Science degree in Gender and Development Studies. She also holds Bachelor of Arts degree in literature, and she is a vocal introvert. That's very interesting, Stacey. Stacey's passion for advocacy is evident in the way she uses her poetry to tackle social issues. And this is highlighted in her six books, which includes The Chronicles of a Woman, Truth Teller, The Broken Repair, and Peace Hunting, Volumes 1 and 2. Welcome to our podcast, Stacey.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me.
All right. So I just want to just move a little in our question, Stacey.
Right.
In terms of the theme, from an academic and policy perspective, how would you define a gender transformative agenda? And why do you think it's critical for achieving true gender equality? Over to you, Stacey.
Thank you. Gender transformative approach contributes to achieving gender equality for everyone by looking at the root causes of gender inequality. A gender transformative agenda from an academic perspective aims at dismantling and interrogating harmful gender stereotypes while creating a learning environment that fosters and empowers all students at all levels to change attitudes and behaviors that disadvantage not just women, but any group in society that is unable to access the resources that we all should have access to, which is our human right. From a policy perspective, the gender transformative agenda seeks to create gender equality, but from a systemic and structural approach. In other words, this is where laws and sanctions are created to ensure that certain gender discriminations are not being perpetuated in our homes, at schools, anywhere that we pretty much coexist. The gender transformative agenda is critical for achieving gender equality because it means that we are actively engaging men and women to address the cause of gender inequality at its core. So this includes policy changes, research with pertinent methodologies that would incorporate a gender disaggregated data and education that's geared towards inclusivity. And from my perspective, policy and education are, they're symbiotic because we can't have changes in the agenda without educating the public or without creating a system that ensures that we all understand what gender inequality is.
Okay, thank you for that, Stacey. And I would invite Judith to just comment on this.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this already interesting panel podcast. I am impressed and happy that the name of the thing is a gender transformative agenda, the road to achieving gender equality. So I remind us that we have a history that precedes us. This business of gender inequality, um, discrimination against women and men of all kinds didn't begin with our lives, our current lives. That we have a history of several hundred years in which the plantation economy, Jamaica was one huge plantation of several plantations that grew sugar, right? Now, on those plantations, there was a patriarchal expression of what it was to be man. Yes? And if you think about it, some of the things that we refer to quite often, we recognize is we recognize that elements of that patriarchal structure and system are still with us. So I like to remind myself and the listening audience that we need to always remember where we are coming from. Because as long as the patriarchy is present in the structures and institutions of our countries, the more work we will have to do to help women and men dismantle the patriarchy, to understand that the patriarchy affects both women and men in different ways, negative as well, and therefore to talk about a transformative agenda as the pathway to gender equality means we have to acknowledge our history and where we're coming from. I'd just like to add one final thing and ask us to consider during slavery. Did women during slavery times own their bodies? And the obvious question is no. Did they have a right to decide when to have children? No. Or who should be their children's father? No. Especially because women's bodies belong to their white slave owners who did whatever they wanted to do with women whenever they felt like it. Now, fast forward to today day, in the Jamaican expression, we have made some progress because over time, there have been development programs and new policies, and the society has evolved. We have some legislation in place to address violence against women and girls. So in Jamaica, women, for the most part, can and do choose their child's father, unless, of course, they're raped and become pregnant. That is, they are robbed of their right to say no, to protect their bodies from sexual and physical abuse, and to protect themselves from the associated trauma and the emotional abuse. Now, we know now that emotional trauma is not something you just, sure, it's all right, get over it. No, it doesn't work like that. We know that, right? And some of that trauma becomes intergenerational because our father, our mother, grandmother, great grandmother, some of whom children are still alive to remember that in those days, the women had no right over their bodies. And therefore, I am aware that many therapists nowadays think about intergenerational, the transmission of trauma across generations. I mean, I am aware, for example, of a young mother, young, 35, young enough, who is aware that her daughter, teenage daughter, is being harassed and is being proposed and threatened. If you don't give me the sex, this is what I'm going to do with you. And the mother said, it's all right. It's just a little sex. You will survive. I did too. And that's today. So I'm glad I got an opportunity to establish the context and the place from which I am coming and against the background against which there are other issues I will address as the podcast evolves.
Thank you for that, sisters. Very, very interesting. And I'm really happy that you took us to the historical context in order for us to know how we're going to transform this gender transformative agenda. So the discussions, they're ripening. So let me just move back to Stacy. If we're to think about how we pave this pathway, so we're talking about the journey towards, right? We have to look at the structural and systemic issues. So, in looking at these issues, what are the main institutional and societal barriers that hinder gender equality in the Caribbean? And I take it out of Jamaica now because we want a little,
Right.
regional perspective.
Judy mentioned a very key statement that I think can guide the rest of this discussion as to, why we are still having this conversation today. The "you will survive, I did too" mindset is one that continues in every aspect of where we see gender inequality. Another woman would say to you, you will survive, I did too. Quite interesting. And so institutional barriers would include pay gap, economic disparities, limited access to resources, limited access to decision making, limited opportunities for advancement in certain sectors. And societal barriers would include a cultural mindset. Gender based violence is a massive one. Um, Unequal access to education, unequal role in family responsibilities, early pregnancy. We know that if the young girl gets pregnant, she's the one who her entire situation is interrupted as opposed to the dad who gets to continue, and I mentioned GBV because it affects the entire ecology of the woman's situation. When she is experiencing gender based violence, she pretty much cannot function. Her parenting is affected, how she operates on the job is affected, how she operates in school is affected. And so that is a major societal barrier. Um, and I do believe also that GBV affects the man, even the perpetrator of gender based violence. Is probably something that we don't necessarily we right. If you notice, when we have these forums, you always have mainly women, which is quite interesting. So those are the societal and institutional barriers.
Really happy you brought that out. Yes, just a minute, Judith. Just a minute. Because our men are of the view that, when we have these discussions, they're not included. And I'm really happy it's something you brought up because we have to have the conversation so that there is, if we speak about inclusivity, then we're really living it. So thank you for raising that. Sister Judith, go ahead.
So, yes, it is true. I'm quite accustomed to, in the middle of a conversation like this, a voice from the audience will say, "And what about the men?"
Yes.
So I am prepared. However, and you mentioned that men who are the perpetrators of GBV are also affected. So my question is, how are they affected? If, as a perpetrator of GBV, let's just say in his heart, him know, him did beat her up. Him know.
Right.
Or him know that she's his girlfriend, she was having her period, and him she said no, and him say, "No, I want it." I mean, that's real life. So my question then is, what is going through his mind that allows him to think that it's okay? Because there's a certain point in which he thinks it's okay. So I tend not to make excuses for the men. I'm be quite frank. But what I do think we need to understand is how the patriarchy operates. It it requires that men act a certain way to be called a man.
Right.
And that's how our society generally shapes young men.
The harmful gender
The harmful gender stereotypes.
Right.
So my recommendation is to sit with young men who are willing to be honest and say yes and no, I shouldn't do it. But I saw this thing said, if I'm not a man, I'm going to say I'm a baby. They're going to describe all me as all kinds of things that let me feel I am not a man. So I'm glad we are having these conversations, and I certainly endorse that we must engage them respectfully. I am not going to trace off any man that says do, but I'm going to require of him that he accepts responsibility for what he did. Yeah. And from that space, we can then say, well, why you think you did it? You're not a bad, evil, wicked man all the time. Why? And then we can have a conversation about the patriarchy, a word he may or may not even know, but help him to understand that that is how the system is shaping him to be a certain kind of man to be accepted.
which is which is thank you, which is what the gender transformative approach is all about. It's all about interrogating, it's all about coming up with solutions. It's inclusive, and so for men to see that some of these actions that they're perpetrating are harmful because of the harmful gender stereotypes.
Can I say one thing
Yes.
about the gender transformative approach? So one of my questions, statements in the thing says, many public institutions still operate within traditional gender norms. These are norms that have an expected behavior, thoughts, and expectations of each other, male and female. So a gender transformative approach for me will support and promote gender equality by explicitly addressing the underlying causes of the gender equality, which causes which are related to the existing gender norms. So you can't get away from the fact that there are existing gender norms. And that is what is driving the gender inequality. So we have to deal with the norms and say, well, we want gender equality. What are we going to do about the gender norms, which are precisely okay? And yeah, I mean, there's something here about recommendations I made for certain approaches within the public sector. For example, Justice Sarah has members in the public sector mostly, right? Does Justice Sarah have policy against sexual exploitation? That's what you call it. But but there is a PSEA, which is not unrelated. It's a similar expression that says at the workplace, the authorities, the head of the workplace, need to train everybody on staff to recognize sexual exploitation or harassment when it is happening in the workplace. There's signs.
Just repeat that acronym for us.
PSEA.
And that's policy.
Protection. The P means protection from sexual exploitation and abuse. PSEA. Right? There are United Nations draft templates that are available because it's founded in international law. We have our own sexual harassment and prevention law, which is the tool, the legislation we would use to ensure that it is enforced. The PSEA is enforced. Because if the case goes to court, national law, national legislation is what takes precedent, and we have one. So it is important for institutions like Justice Sarah to engage your members in whichever public sector institutions to say this is what should operate in the institution. And it would be to your advantage if Justice Sarah had its own PSEA.
This is something we need to look into, Judith. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
So, just for us to continue with the engaging and thought provoking discussions, I would like to ask you, how can governments and organizations shift? Because we're talking about transformative agenda. How do we shift from a simple gender sensitive policy towards gender transformative action?
Judy made a very profound, or I guess it's a reminder that legislation takes precedence. So that should tell us something. So we can talk all we want. We need to have something in place that protects the rights, right? But the goals should be.
That legislation is gender neutral. So in the workplace, sorry, the legislation, the language of it is gender neutral. So it is relevant and applicable on behalf of women and men in the workplace. It's very important that remember that.
All right. So to respond to that question, the goals should be to ensure that policies are inclusive and do not exclude. I mean, I'm reiterating certain groups. Therefore, it's not enough to just acknowledge and understand that gender disparities exist. There must be an intentional quest to challenge a mindset and showcase the impact of harmful gender norms and make changes that bridge the gender gap in key areas. So the government and policymakers must carry out a series of training courses to educate on the impact of the issues and disparities and include men and boys in all aspects of the policymaking process to include the defining of the problem, the decision making, the evaluating the effectiveness of the policy and the policy implementation. You used the example earlier about a man who, the perpetrator of GBV, that he knows that he did something wrong. But, to include men and boys in that, listen, this is causing a problem and this is what we're trying to do to address these issues. So it's important for policymakers to be inclusive in their efforts in order for the gender transformative agenda to be accomplished.
All right. I'm going back a little to Judith. You emphasized and re-emphasized the national legislation, and I go back to countries, seeking to get international conventions being ratified, and the approach to how, we as a country even seek to have our ILO conventions ratified. I know currently Convention 190, Recommendation 206, has been, and this has to do with um, violence and harassment in the world of right in the world of work. But I know Jamaica, we have our legislation, but from a worker perspective, how do we really get this integrated into pushing? I think we're of the view that because we have law, we don't need to ratify.
Get it integrated into the way the workplace operates. That's what you're asking.
Right.
The
So how does
workplace in
that
any
help to
public
create the
sector
change?
institution
Right.
or a private sector
Any
institution,
workplace.
right? Well, the first thing I think we need to understand is and accept that it is absolutely necessary to protect the women and the men in the workplace. And you need legislation which is gender neutral, so it doesn't discriminate against men, but it is gender neutral. So my question would be to say to Justice Sarah, get a copy of the sexual harassment prevention legislation, sit down with it, and look at those sections that say how is such an offense recognized. And if it is recognized, what are the steps you now take? You're supposed to have internal pathways in each organization that would say, okay, Judith, I am one of the persons recognized in the institution to support this. My job is to interview the perpetrator, interview the person who made the claim, their conditions, yes? Make sure that it is that you understand the law. So I, if I am that person, can say, well, this needs to go to the tribunal at the ministry to take it to the next step. But that tribunal is going to need me to provide certain information about what actually happened. Yeah.
Necessary. Yeah, well, yes, we have a lot of work to do. Let me just move a little into having us discuss a topic that I think we always try to stick to: intersectionality and inclusion. How does the concept of intersectionality shape the gender transformative agenda? Again, in the Caribbean context.
Right. Such a nice big buzzword, right? But intersectionality is not just a concept, it's a reality. We all have several variables or identity markers that we walk around with on any given day that impacts how we operate and respond to our environment and how our environment responds to us. Intersectionality is the framework that helps us to understand each other within the ambits of our social and political identities, and that makes us marginalized in some way. So, this could include race, gender, your ability, your mental ability, your physical ability, or the lack thereof, class, sexual orientation, your religion, your height, your immigration status, your body type, any of that, and a whole host of things. A few years ago, I coined the phrase everyone is marginalized somewhere. So, yes, if you really think about it, you might agree that we are. So, if everybody operates with the mindset that we are all marginalized, right? Really think about it, then we may understand that intersectionality as a framework is a key component of activating the gender transformative agenda, and an important one to ensure that our human rights is not compromised.
It's a beautiful segue for me. So, my question here that I was asked to respond to says, how can we ensure that gender transformation includes women from diverse backgrounds, such as rural women, women with disabilities, and women from the LGBT community, individuals. So, my take on this is first of all, we need to respect and understand the lived realities and experiences of all women because those lived realities are often very, very different from mine personally. So if I am concerned about gender transformation, then I should be committed to understanding their lived realities.
Yes.
It's not mine, but I can't claim gender to be gender transformative and ignore the realities of other women. Okay, so I would need to ensure that these realities and the rights of all women are central to the design of a gender transformative program and strategies which will challenge the inbuilt discriminatory norms and practices, whether it's against the rural women, it's against women with disabilities. And I'm glad you raised the business of women with disabilities. So I gave some examples of how to respond. So inbuilt discriminatory norms and practices such as failure to provide appropriate entrances and exits to schools and offices for persons with physical disabilities, refusal to serve an individual from the LGBT community, refusal to provide health cares to individuals from that community, failure to acknowledge the added vulnerability of women in wheelchairs to sexual harassment and rape. How often do we think about that? So I'm glad we're having this conversation because I believe it will help us all to better understand where we fit in this larger community of persons, and if we're committed to challenging the gender norms, the negative gender norms, then here's an opportunity for us to do something about it. And then there are other examples: failure to address or challenge sexual harassment in offices and workplaces. I know nothing. You only came up to the water thing and touched my bottom and said, "Hi, gorgeous." That's sexual harassment, and it is not to be tolerated, right? And some of these challenges are present in a household. Household workers put up with that. If they complain, they lose their work. Or in a school and in some religious institutions where sometimes there's not enough honesty to acknowledge that it is happening. And then when there's a big bust up and it come out in the press, it is a challenge, right? So I that's my take on it because I believe that development programs that are seeking to correct, if that's the right word, the gender disparities in a workplace or a household should challenge and transform the harmful gender stereotypes and inequalities and reduce the possibilities of gender discrimination. And I'm saying that to include everybody in every workplace and community centers and wherever.
Thank you for that, Judith. I just want to keep the mic with Judith because there is a follow up when we talk about inclusivity. One of the key issues in gender equality is care work.
Hmm.
How can recognizing care as a public good contribute to gender transformation
Okay.
and economic justice?
You know what I say to people? Care work is real work. And it is usually done at home for no pay. The mother or woman has no income of her own, well, in generally, and is dependent on somebody, the father or her partner. So at home, care work denies the woman, the mother, the opportunity and right to work outside the home, work from which the entire household would benefit. We give the women the benefit of the doubt. If she's going to get a work and she's earning an extra $12,000 a week, she's not going to come home with it and hug it up. No, she's a mother. Yes, so a mother working outside the home brings in another income, which can be used to put children in daycare. If she can find affordable daycare, that's another matter. But the principle is cover transportation costs to and from school. Children disappear in taxis. So the mother would now have some money to get a rail taxi in which she could be confident that her girl child or boy child would reach school and come back home and cover the cost of more healthy foods. Care work is a public good, taking care of family, both adults and children, teaching children to eat sensibly, to carry out household chores, and creating families in which respect for each other is taught and embraced. So it's a package. It's not just about what money you have, but if the mother is working and it comes home, then there's a space in which she can talk about it. And respecting care work in this way acknowledges its inherent value, not only to the immediate family, but to also the economy. It also helps to reduce challenges across generations because many times in households with a mother, and maybe the father, there's a grandmother helping to look after the children. But the way grandma used to do it, it no works anymore. So you have to negotiate with grandma and help her to understand, well, this is how we have to do it this way. So for me, this reduces intergenerational poverty in ways that benefit the current family and the children within it.
Yep. If you wanted to add anything.
No, I was just thinking. I cannot imagine that anybody would think about care work and see that as just nothing. I mean, I know it happens, but I just when you think about all of the things that women do, or there are some men who stay at home and take care of the family, right? It takes a lot energy, mental, the physical. So I just can't understand why anybody would look at care work as, but it
And
happens.
and we saw this during COVID.
Yes, yes.
The burden
Was on the
being left
woman.
on the woman.
Yes,
So
yes.
it's something I believe we need to have more discussions on, especially as an association as we negotiate.
Right.
for better wages, salaries, working conditions, etc. All right, so very thought provoking, and I just want to continue. And we're now at the point of how do we overcome the challenges? And of course, with challenges, there will be resistance when you talk about change,
Right.
right? So, what are some of the biggest challenges and resistance that you have seen in achieving anything having to do with enhancement of the gender approach?
From me, the biggest challenge is buy-in. If we do not accept that there are harmful gender norms, that there is a gender disparity in education, in the workplace, in politics, in home life, if there's not an overarching acceptance that these issues exist, then it's going to be difficult to achieve the goals of the agenda. And that's it. If there isn't buy-in, then as the Jamaicans would say, dog me Mustafa. Anything you want to add?
I endorse exactly what you said, but I would like to put a slightly different take on it. And going back to the family space, the household, in which any shifts from what is the traditional is often problematic. So, for example, we were discussing earlier that in the care work space where women don't earn because they have to stay at home, the man is in charge, he makes all the decisions. So there are unequal relations in power between the mother and the father in the household, between the mother and the father in the household. So here's thinking of how practically we could engage men and boys in a conversation to say it's okay for your baby mother or your wife to work. It's okay for her to bring home money. How are you going to decide? Who is going to decide how her money that she earned is spent? So here's a little scenario, right? A mother decides to get a job and now earns more or less the same as her husband. Together, they list all household related bills as well as expenses for the children's upkeep and welfare. So now, adding both salaries earned by mother and father, they observe that it is less difficult to pay all the bills associated with their household now because there are two incomes. They decide together how to spread the costs across all bills and realize that they may even be able to save some money. Now, this requires that they discuss the values of a shared decision making process. It's not him one decide, and it's not she one decide either because she's mother. And discuss the value of not seeing the process as taking power away from him, the father. And that as father, he's no less of a man for ensuring that this discussion and redistribution of decision making takes place. And in that way, we're challenging the traditional patriarchal understanding of what it is to be a man and who should be in charge. And we're setting an example across generations for the children to learn that it is possible for those kinds of conversations to happen between teenage girls and teenage boys, teenage mothers, which we don't really recommend, but it happens. So that's how I would approach it, acknowledging that it may not be easy, but I have actually been in a workshop, couple of workshops where after this similar kind of scenario, and the men said, "Boy, I true, the decision making thing can work. Trust is built, and that is so important."
Yeah, this is very necessary for us, and I'm here just thinking about how do we drill down this kind of information? Do we go into the schools, the guidance counselors, and that level? How do we get to the workplace? In terms of actioning. the change. So this brings me now to the actionable solutions and how we move towards the future. But can we share some successful examples of gender transformation?
Well, there are three things that's coming to mind. The first one is the UN Women through the Women's Empowerment Principles web, right? So they're doing an amazing job at different implementing, sharing different initiatives. So, for example, by way of training courses and webinars, they continue to drive the transformative agenda by addressing gender disparities in corporate governance, which I believe is very, very important. So, for example, they have a free training program on unconscious bias, right? Unconscious bias, I believe, is very, 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 very important to, because sometimes we enter into situations and we don't realize that we're contributing to gender inequality because of unconscious biases that we enter into the situation with. And so for them to, for web to recognize this as an issue and to be addressing it, I believe is amazing. They also have a series of webinars throughout the year that challenges gender stereotypes and come up with solutions for change, specifically on the job. And then UNICEF has made available to the public its Gender Transformative Education Manual that shows the transformational power of education at all levels. This manual, I believe, is also an excellent resource for reimagining education toward inclusivity. And of course, there is the IGDS, the Institute of Gender and Development Studies at the UEMONA. They're constantly driving the gender transformative agenda with people like Dr. Delia Bean and Dr. Mortley, who are ensuring that academia remains consistent with establishing and implementing real change. So, for example, they're going out into schools, they're helping students to change certain negative gender stereotypes, which will ultimately, because we have to start when they're young, you know, if we're saying it's not okay to hit your girlfriend because she said something that you don't like, and explain to them why and how it affects, a wider society, we have to start young. So those are the three areas: the UN web, the UNICEF manual, and the IGDS at UEMO.
Right. So I will endorse the work that should be done with the webs. I've done some of it myself, and I think it is unfortunately underrated and under-recognized. If corporate Jamaica would take that on seriously, except for the one or two who already signed, but it's very few. So I endorse the immediate use of webs to train their staff and identify the budgeting to train the staff, etc. I go back to relevant government institutions. The government, public sector institutions, their employees number a large part of the employed labor force, right? So I would engage or insist or encourage relevant government institutions to provide support for the enforcement of equal pay for work of equal value legislation. It's on the books. How is it enforced? In the public sector, is it? Now, one might say it shouldn't be a problem because if you're going to be a officer grade level 3.6, they have the ratings, then all of us in with that rating should be earning the same. That that's my understanding of how it should work. So we need to ensure that that rating description of posts and then you're given a number actually represent equal pay for work of equal value between women and men. That's very important in the public sector. I believe the public sector has to lead by example. Then the business of WEPs for the private sector and ensure that women working in all sectors, public, private, education, and household workers have access to paid maternity leave as provided by the Jamaican law. Now, I know, for example, that need to household workers need to pay their NIS because it is the NIS that, if they get pregnant, covers their maternity leave. Yeah, you didn't know that. Check it. It's true. But most people don't know that. So they're working along, and if you're a household worker and you work 3 days a week, you have your employers, because it's less than a week of work, 7 days work and 40 hours and all of that. No, so they have the responsibility of paying their own NIS. So so when you need maternity leave, that's where the resources will come from to get it. Who? Education.
That the policymakers or the persons in charge are not doing a good enough job.
Well,
If they don't know this, which is
can I just
important
tell you, I know
information.
this because the Household Workers Union itself has started to do it for their members.
Okay.
Right? So I've done a lot of work with them. They're not waiting on the government. They're not working on the government. They know that their
Okay.
members can benefit if. So the responsibility is for the members to pay the NIS
Oh,
and the NHT too.
right.
You understand?
Right.
Okay. And finally, the business of the PSEA policy. Finally, those are the actions that I would recommend to drive gender transformation in many sectors across the board in different ways. And I believe our society stands to benefit manifold ways.
Right.
So, as we look ahead, what do you think are the most urgent priorities? I would have heard from Judith for achieving gender transformation.
Uh, Several, right? So, as we know, 3 decades ago, there were 12 critical areas of concern agreed upon at the Beijing Women's Conference, the Beijing Platform for Action, and these are women and poverty, education and training of women, violence against women, women and health, women and armed conflict, women and the economy, women in power and decision making, institutional mechanisms for advancement of women, human rights of women, women and the media, women and the environment, and the girl child. I would say that though we have made some strides, we're still fighting the battle in all the areas. We need to prioritize the involvement of all marginalized groups in the decision making process, which means that everybody must sit at the policy making table to challenge the damaging gender stereotypes. Um, the area that I would consider urgent priority areas would be the area of women and the environment, right? When we think about, for example, climate change. So we need to ensure that women and men are part of the discussion because climate change affects men differently than it does women. Human mobility is a big part of the climate change discussion. So, for example, how we transport and house displaced men and women in a natural disaster is very critical to the recovery process. And so I think that's a key and urgent area to prioritize. And we're going back again to gender-based violence as an area, urgent priority area. The impact is that it will hinder the gender transformative agenda because it perpetuates inequality, right? It hinders social and economic development. We mentioned earlier that when a woman experiences gender-based violence, it affects every aspect of her ecology. It affects her how she performs on the job. It affects how she operates in school. It affects her capacity to parent. It affects her mental space. And so that is something that we have to think about. I remember once I had a student who she was at the first part of the semester, she was pretty much involved. And then I noticed that she was just not submitting any assignments. I kept reaching out to her and didn't hear back from her. At the end of it, when all the grades were submitted, I heard by way of the office that she was um, being abused by her partner. And because of that, even though she paid her school fee, which we know that most of us struggle with, she was not able to finish. And even though we were willing to extend ourselves and allow her to do the assignments, she just could not. So that is another area. And another one is the issues with the girl child. That is still a problem because the human traffickers are finding very creative ways to continue with this. So this is something that, but not just girls, boys are being trafficked as well. And this is something that we have to, keep at. And the final one is education and training of men, women, boys, and girls. That is very, very important. If we want to see real transformation take place, if we want to deconstruct, to discuss, to change the negative and harmful gender stereotypes, we have to bring everybody in. It cannot just be that every time we have a forum, it's only women. We have to, we need to have the voices of everybody, not just men and women, boys and girls, but the different, and whatever it is that makes you unique in your own identity, we need to have conversations so that our human rights are not being compromised. And so to recap, the areas of urgent priority would be women and the environment, to have a discussion regarding climate change and how, women and men respond to it, gender-based violence because of its massive impact, the issue with the girl child and the boy, and education and training.
So thank you for saying everything. My only challenge for now is to say to ourselves, I don't like it when I go somewhere and we're having a gender discussion and it's 26 women and 2 men. The question is how to get the men to participate. So I am not interested in not doing the work with women if the men don't show up. How do we reach out to the men? So I suggested a couple of ways earlier to help men to see that it doesn't make them less of a man to participate. We need to hear what you feel, how you feel, how can you fix what you did? Do you want to fix what you did? I cannot speak on behalf of a man or a boy. I acknowledge that hands down, but I will ask you some questions about why you did what you did. So I endorse everything you said and throw it back out to us. We really have to wrap our heads around getting men to understand that their participation in the conversations are important, but they also have to make up their minds to participate.
And just to add to that, we also need to reiterate to our male audience that when we talk about gender inequality, it's not us bashing. It's not us bashing. It's us trying to ensure that we create a safe space where we can access the resources that ensures that our human rights are not compromised. And that means for you, the man, and for me, the woman. It's not a male bashing thing, right? Yeah.
Really happy that we brought out the whole thing about having the men and the boys being more participative. And I do believe, even for this podcast, we have men who are on and listening, but I think there's still an unsettling question of, do they really want to hear our views?
Tell them,
We want to hear your views.
tell them that I don't know how many women you represent. I know how many I represent, and we want to hear your views.
Want to hear the views of the
However,
men.
can I just say, when we first started this work, I don't, you're too young to remember. When women were being abused for a long time, when you went to the police station and reported, they said, chuck home, a man woman business, go and fix it. And so the report was not taken. So while we were clamoring and saying there is abuse taking place, there were no records to prove it. So no, I think that is what is facing men. They have to make up their minds if they're being abused by their female partner.
Yes.
Set your brethren, come with me to the police station. I need a little support. Go to the police station and report it. Once it's reported, it becomes a figure. It contributes to the figure that will say, yes, X number of men and boys are actually being abused.
Yes.
If we don't have that, it's hearsay. And if you want to fix it, we can work on hearsay.
But also, why don't we have that data? It's because of the negative and harmful gender stereotypes. So or which is why we need to have men being in the conversation, because imagine that you're being abused by your wife, your girlfriend. Usually the men are ashamed. They don't want to have this conversation with anybody, and so they keep it. But the truth is, men are also being abused, and so this is a part of what the gender transformative agenda is promoting, is the idea that we are trying to create gender equity, gender equality in all spaces, including to address the issue of men being abused by women.
In and of itself will address the gender inequality,
There you go.
Mm-hmm.
right?
Definitely.
Yeah.
You keep taking words out of my mouth, but I have no problem with that. Just to endorse what you say
Yes.
and say to my brethren, friends, beg you, go and report it.
Yes.
Never mind what anybody else say. Really, that's what we need to get.
But there's another part to that, because sometimes the members of the law, the law enforcers, are a major part of the problem why the reporting doesn't take place. So no, so imagine a man goes to a police station, which the cultural mindset, right, to report, which is a serious crime, and the police is laughing at you. So which is why education is so important. The education aspect of it is so important, because we, with this transformative agenda, it is not just about acknowledging that these issues exist, but taking deliberate and intentional actions in a cross collaborative manner at addressing all of these issues. Right.
Justice Sarah has a little rank and stink ability, don't? So if Justice Sarah writes to the Commissioner of Police and asks to have an audience with whomever is responsible for the training of their officers who
Yes.
are in these police
Yes.
stations, tested.
Yes.
He would be hard pressed not to say yes. Set up the meeting
Right.
and have the persons doing the training, because our police officers are subject to the same cultural and social norms,
Right.
etc.
Right. Right.
So test it, Madam Jensek from Jassisera, and say, we need you to help us do the work we need to do. Therefore, can we have a meeting and a training? You can get people to do the training. That's not a hard part. Okay? Agree?
Yes,
Yes.
yes, and address the issue of the unconscious biases, because I do believe that that's a major part of us maintaining the negative gender stereotypes.
Well, I'm very happy. And this is a discussion that we'll continue to have.
Yes.
You know, sometimes persons will be on the side saying, "Does this make sense?" Yes, it does
It does
make
make sense.
sense.
Yes.
And we have to empower each other. We have to address these unconscious biases. We have to address this in a manner that it looks at the cross-cutting sectors. This is how you have to deal with a comprehensive approach to gender transformation. So, sisters, I'm not calling the ladies, sisters, I must really express my appreciation and thanks to you and to my wonderful team here this afternoon for this engaging session with you. Academia, real life experience. I mean, it's amazing to have you both as our presenters on this panel. Thank you very much.
Yes, and
And
thank you for having me.
to our viewers, thank you very much for staying on and for listening to this very important topic. Sister Judith.
Thank you for having me. I'm quite happy to come back again.
All right, definitely. So it sounds
I
like we
sanction
need a
that.
part two.
Yes, yes, I sanction that.
Right.
Yes.
So Stacy and Judith, on behalf of our officers, we have our president who is online. Of course, she could not make it. But on behalf of the president, her officers, the executive committee, our general council, and the wider membership, much thanks and appreciation to you and blessings. Have yourselves a good evening. Tune out.